Get to it. Um, Good morning. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm so excited for the guest that I have today. My name is Sandra Nicholson, and I'm out here in Los Angeles, and this is Into the Room, and we're happy to have a very special guest who's all the way back east. Um, this gentleman, he's done so much, and currently, right now, what caught my attention about him, there's this documentary called Shame of Chicago, Shame of the Nation. And I am originally from Chicago, so I had to reach out to him and just find out more about this documentary, how it all went down. And as I was doing my research, I discovered even more about him. So I want you all to welcome, join me, Mr. Chris L. Jenkins.
Thank you, Sandra. Thanks for having me. And really, I've done some research
Yeah.
on you, and
Oh,
really, I've done some research on you, and really
oh,
appreciate. Sorry, let me get my microphone set here a little bit. There we go. And I've really enjoyed getting to know, just learning a little bit about you and what you're up to out there in LA.
oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. So as I was saying, I was it's so many things because as I was doing my research, I discovered that you went to school out here. Actually,
Hmm.
you had gone to UC Berkeley, and you also attended USC,
That's right.
and you received a master's. Well, your first master's was, I believe, was at UC
Right.
Berkeley, and then you went and got a special
Hmm.
degree. Both of them was in journalism,
That's right.
but the special journalism was here out at
That's
USC.
right.
And you went to
That's right.
Oberlin College.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
so, so I was like, okay,
Hmm.
cool. And you started working for the Washington Post. You
Hmm.
did 20 years working
Almost.
as
Yeah. 17. Yeah.
17.
Hmm.
Okay. And you led the team to the point where, or you were part of the team to the point you all won a Pulitzer Prize for
Hmm.
the extensive coverage on the mass shooting of Virginia Tech. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I mean, I was like, oh, Pulitzer Prize, wow.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but with all of that, and then I also read one of your articles. It had to do with gentrification. You was talking about the restaurant Den, and that
Hmm.
was funny to me. You wanted to check, their cultural card at the door.
That's right. That's right.
And so I was like, okay, he's a cool brother. But with all that, said and done, thank you. Unfortunately today Bruce won't be joining us, but I know he's the creator and he was director, editor, and producer of Shame of Chicago, Shame of the Nation. Um, thank you. Send a shout out to
Hmm.
him too.
Hmm.
But you know, I want to know, you've done more than just one film,
Hmm.
but to start off first with Shame
Hmm.
of Chicago,
Hmm.
what attracted you to this project? Because you have a lot of activism, social
Hmm.
justice in your
Yeah.
background.
Yeah. That's right.
But what particularly, you being not from Chicago,
Yeah.
but from the East Coast, what drew you to this documentary?
Yeah. So, the last 15 years has really been a eye-opening, I think, there's been a lot of revelations about the last 75 years
Mm,
and
mhm,
the ways in which African Americans, were cut out of the real estate industry products in the mid 20th century. Ta-Nehisi Coates's, case for reparations story, that came out 10 years ago, I think this month.
mhm.
Really sort of blew the doors off of what really had been going on with FHA loans and the inability of African Americans to get them. There's an incredible book called Family Properties by a woman named Beryl Satter that looks at, it's really what the basis of the first episode of Shame of Chicago, Shame of the Nation is based on. It's about contract buying in Chicago in the 50s and 1960s. The only way African Americans could get into a home back then in Chicago was to rent to own schemes or contracts that weren't actually mortgages. And so, the last 15 years has been a lot of journalism and books that really sort of take a look at what this wealth gap that we're experiencing right now is all about. And it's really about the last 75 years. And how white folks coming after World War II were able to get certain loans and move into the suburbs, and African Americans weren't, and that the wealth in this country, generally speaking, is built on assets, largely through real estate, not through just getting a job and making a lot of money and working hard. Usually, when we think about the middle class in this country, it's built through asset-based middle class, asset-based products that African Americans were not allowed to get into. And so, for starters, that is what really attracted me to what Bruce was up to when he approached me to help him produce and write and direct one of the episodes. And it dawned on me that we have these conversations about reparations in this country, and a lot of times it's based in like around the conversation around slavery, and we all know that slavery is obviously this country's original sin, and so that obviously continues to have huge impacts on our modern day life. But if we look at the last 75 years, if we look at the ways in which white folks really took off with their abilities to build wealth, and African Americans weren't, starting after World War II. It's really in this period that we need to really think about this conversation around reparations, because it's not just about your great granddaddy who may have been a slave owner. It's about your father or grandfather who had opportunities that my father or your father may not have. And that was what was interesting to me about, delving into this conversation and through this series about that piece of our history that, like most parts of our real history is, buried. And not even, so white folks obviously don't have this conversation very often, but black folks don't have it very often either. And what was important to me was to continue to inform our community about what we've been through, but also to show our resistance at every step of the way. One of the other things that was a hallmark of this series about not only the history of this pernicious history of keeping black folks from generating wealth over the last 75 years, is that black folks were always trying to figure out ways to fight back. And that's one thing that we don't also often give ourselves credit for. If your viewers have seen the first episode, which is called The Color Tax, it really goes into how black folks, woke up one day and realized, wait a minute, these rent-to-own contracts that we're getting are not the same thing that white folks are being introduced to white folks. And once they realized the schemes that were going on, that there were syndicates in downtown Chicago by largely law firms and doctors who were putting together syndicates to raise money in order to get black folks into these rent-to-own contracts. Once they realized that, they're like, no, we ain't having that. And the second half of that episode goes into the fight that something called the Contract Buyers League took on to fight back against what was going on the south and west sides of Chicago to black folks. And I think one of the hallmarks of, I think, our modern day storytelling, particularly for African Americans, is that we don't want to just be seen as victims all the time. And we're not into we're not trying to do no racist porn here. We're trying to also show how we were active agents in our freedom and liberation, even outside of the normal conversations about the civil rights movement. These are working class black folks on the south side of Chicago who organized themselves and took it to these moneyed landowners and property owners and fought back. And we need to be reminded of that. I think every single day, that we never took this stuff laying down. And that was one of the other things that was important to me in being in joining Bruce on developing this project. And like you mentioned, like I do have an actor's background, and like most African American journalists, I got into this business or into the storytelling business to tell our stories, one way or another. And so this was just another opportunity to do so.
Right. Um, I guess creative people, we can relate to that because I too have that same kind of background acting as well. And so, and you know, I grew up in Chicago, and I when my mother and I, because she was recently a divorced mom, we moved into an all-white neighborhood. It was Polish, and I know what the racism. I was young, but I know what the racism that she encountered, and I wrote a story about it and did a short film on it. So I knew of the racism from that point, and even going to school, there it was a running joke if you lived on the South Side and if you went to school downtown. I went to college at Columbia, and when or work, and when you take the subway or the train, the L we call it,
Hmm.
on one side of the tracks it was all black folks. On the other side, it was all, white folks. Going north, we were going south. And you could see the divide just in that, even though, here we are, this is in the 90s, but still, that was a visual kind of symbol of segregation because just you saw who lived up north and you saw who lived, heading south. Um, when I was watching the film, The Color Tax, uh, excellent. First of all, well done. Just the whole thing. I've watched, I think, three and a half so far. Just well done. What stood out to me is it reminded me of what you have these cash, what they would call speculators, or
Speculators. Hmm. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And what they were doing to our people is they could never get any equity out of getting into these contracts, and it was just a straight hustle. And finally, what I love is that a light bulb went off, and they were like, "Wait a minute, this is wrong. We have to do something." And it took a lot of courage for them to say, "You know what? We're not giving y'all no more money
Hmm.
until you change this." Um, and they had to hold back. I'm a big I had this conversation with a very prominent attorney who's very much into civil rights, and I said to him, when all the shootings were happening left and right, and I had said, I said, why can't we just have a boycott? Pull back the money, pull back the money, because we know money
Hmm.
talks. And he was like, Sandra, he says, I agree, but a lot of our people, they're not going to want to give up anything. And my family's from the South, Mississippi to be
Hmm.
exact, and they were sharecroppers. They went on to get their education, but they came up during the time they picked cotton, and doing doing Martin Luther King, they know about the civil rights and the sacrifice of having to give up something to gain something greater. And unfortunately, we've gotten so comfortable with having the assets and material assets, and that's nice, but then it's kind of like we gained a lot and yet we lost a lot.
Hmm.
And the crime rate and everything that we see today wasn't like that.
Hmm.
I would say probably in the 40s and 50s, even to the 60s. It was until afterwards, and everything just kind of like, it's like we lost something, we gained something, and yet we lost something
Hmm.
in the process of it. But what I loved about is to show that how the community just came together, and for 1 year, they and when somebody would be put out, they'll
I
move them
was long.
back in. That
It was
took a
longer
lot of
than that.
courage.
It was longer than that. It was a 7-8 year fight on the contract buyers they took on. This is through the 60s. Essentially they started in 1968 through the mid 70s. But I mean, I hear your point about gain and loss, but and particularly your point about individual racist individuals in these neighborhoods. But I think the point we try to make is to really show that this is institutional. Like, yes, there are, racist actors who we're all aware of going back, to 1619. But,
Yeah.
it's the institutional codification of racist behavior and how that was infused into just how we think about life. Like, let me give you an example. So, you know, I'm sure, at some point in your life, you've been told, well, don't buy, or you've heard, don't buy a house in a black neighborhood, right? And
Yeah.
that's because the valuation, and you're not going to get the same money, the valuation is going to go as high, so on and so forth, right?
Right.
That just didn't, that wasn't just this happened, it wasn't a manna from heaven that all of a sudden black neighborhoods like were devalued. It was because of the real estate industry. We explore in episode 2 how the real estate industry infused racist thinking into how to value neighborhoods.
High
And
Park.
so if there were inharmonious races living with one another, meaning if there were blacks and whites living next to one another in any kind of situation, that neighborhood should be appraised at a lower houses should be appraised, and then the neighborhoods thereby will be appraised at a lower level. This is in 1924, exactly 100 years ago.
Yeah.
By a real estate appraiser, one of the founders of a real estate appraiser named Frederick Babcock, wrote a manual, The Appraisal of Real Estate, and infused into the language of that manual that if there are black people in neighborhoods, that those neighborhoods will be undervalued eventually because white folks eventually will leave, and that no one wants to live around black people. And so, when you were evaluating property, you need to take into consideration whether there are black people there. Now, we've all heard of redlining, but that is the roots of redlining right
Yes.
there. Right. So
Yeah.
it just doesn't start out of nowhere. It wasn't because people decided, oh, well, we're just, we somehow like there's some a decree from the government or something. No, this was a private practice that developed this valuation system that undervalued black people's existence, in neighborhoods. The foundation of that is what led to restrictive covenants, which I'm sure many of your viewers are aware of. The practice of, not allowing black people to live in certain neighborhoods because because deeds are basically written so that, a home cannot be sold to a black person, to keep a neighborhood all white. And that in turn led to the building blocks of redlining, because redlining essentially started, and we didn't call it redlining in the 1930s, but the same people who developed these racist real estate practices in Chicago in the 1920s then went to Washington and wrote the FHA rules in the 1930s that were based on these private racist practices. So, and that essentially started in Chicago. And so, what we're really trying to point out here is that, let's pump the brakes on that segregation was somehow just sort of individual choices that individual people made, that black people want to live around black people and white people live around white people. And sometimes that did happen. But it's the valuation of those neighborhoods through private practice that was turned into public policy is why we have this astounding racial wealth gap, which is majorly is largely driven by real estate and
Right.
the valuation of people's homes.
Right.
And so, it's that kind of it's the definition of institutional racism. But whether it's the color text that you just mentioned, the first episode that goes into the contract buying, or whether it's the second episode that goes into the real estate's place in the Chicago real estate industry in particular, their place in creating these rules and creating these laws and creating this policy, to the intentional segregation of the suburbs and the intentional segregation of public housing in Chicago in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, to blackbusting, which we talk about in the 1970s. All these things are essentially foundationally built by private and public practice coming together to not only segregate cities, but also devalue black
Uh-huh.
neighborhoods
And
throughout not only Chicago, but across the country.
right. When Chicago Plan Part One, I believe that's where the High Park. I
Hmm.
was watching the part about High Park, and many days I spent time hanging out in the High Park,
Hmm.
and it always seemed like it was hip. We had a a joke. We were like, oh, let's go down to Zimbabwe because we thought, oh, it's cultural, it's diverse, not knowing how racist it was, back
I mean,
then, and how they was trying to keep us out the neighborhood.
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
like because now, Muhammad Ali lived down
Hmm.
there, and Louis Farrakhan.
Hmm.
So we thinking this is the upwardly mobile where the black folks live,
Yeah.
but um,
Let me just interject there by saying, Bruce is from Chicago. Producing partner and the creator of the project, Bruce Orenstein, is from
right,
Chicago originally. Was a community organizer in Chicago, and one of I won't say one of the fun things, but certainly one of the things we wanted to sort of stick it to the Hyde Park sort of community was that you have this sense that you're this liberal place, and the whole thing, but it's actually Hyde Park that was the first neighborhood that tried to keep black folks out and actively kicked black folks out of their neighborhood in the 1910s and 1910s for the most part, which led then to restrictive covenants and so on. So,
right,
we hear about neighborhood associations in this country, and a lot of neighborhood associations that were developed in the 19 teens were specifically formed to keep black folks out of their neighborhoods, to organize themselves against black folks moving in or to organize themselves to kick black people out, starting with Hyde Park, in Chicago in particular. So the Hyde Park Improvement Association, formulated itself to, keep black folks out of Hyde Park and then, organize against real estate agents, who would dare to move a black person in and then would go around and say to black people, can we buy you out? Can you move? I mean, so I think there was some irony. I know Chicagoans who are watching this must be like, shaking your head because Hyde Park for the last, I don't know, 75 years or so, maybe 50 years. I'm not, I don't know if all of the recent history of Hyde Park has patted itself on its back collectively for being a liberal and
they
welcoming place, and its
have.
history is not.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember, Kenwood in the school. It was always viewed that that was the area that was hip, that they were like they were a step above on the from the other part of the South Side. So when you felt like when you go down there, and there was beautiful architecture, brownstones, and old money, and so it always had that element. But when I was watching the documentary, and I got mad. And there were some times, literally, there's some parts listening to Mr. Clyde Ross, rest in
Mhm.
peace, him telling his story and how they just took the land, and it was land that was passed down, but they show up and they say, okay, we got your land, and that was it. And it, for me, it was I wanted to watch it, and yet it was painful,
Incredibly
watching part of it
painful.
too. Very painful, and to where it's like I'm gonna hold it in, trying to hold the emotions in. And I even have my mother watching some of the episodes now, and it brings back memories for her in a lot of
I bet it
ways.
does.
And
Yeah.
she was very happy that I was doing this interview
Hmm.
with you. She says our people need to see what was happening,
Hmm.
not just what you said, not just from slavery, but what was happening just within the last, like 75 years. And,
Hmm.
um, you know, how, and there is a huge wealth gap because, like you said, if we don't have access to getting these home loans, then how do you get ahead? And that is one, owning a house or owning some kind of real estate is one way of positioning yourself to gain some type of wealth in this country. From, okay, shame of the nation. I mean, shame of Chicago, shame of the nation. Um, do you think that by doing this film that hopefully more people would be aware? Are the laws changed since then? I mean, it's not like that it hasn't changed that much.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, think about the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, 2009. And who were getting largely those subprime mortgages? People of color. I mean, that is a legacy of the same history. you know. Um, but just going back to your original point about why I wanted to do this, participate and help, produce and write, one of the parts of the episodes is, it we all need a foundation for
Yes.
looking at the present in a way that is formed by the past. And we know our schools don't teach this history. Basically,
No.
even our colleges don't teach a lot of this stuff.
No. No.
And it's I think what your viewers will likely be able to do when they even though our series leaves off in 1977, 78.
Mhm.
Your smart viewers will and listeners and people who tune into your show will be able to make the obvious connection between where we left off in the late 1970s and then how history repeated itself in the late 2000s with the subprime mortgage issue. And by the way, that rent to own contracts actually are making a comeback, in a lot of cities around the country, in Detroit, in Chicago, St. Louis, to the extent to which they do not have some of the same onerous conditions that people like Clyde Russ were dealing with in 1962, but there are still these schemes out there that are taking advantage of, low income folks, who are struggling on the margins, thinking they're trying to, get into into mortgage products, and they're, essentially just, getting into the bottom rung, in these really pernicious schemes. And so, I think, part of what we're trying to do is to give context to not only what I think people know in their bones. Yeah, the thing about well, black folks, and people of color in general is that even if you don't really know all of the ins and outs of what happened in 1952 or 54, you can tell what's happened generally by the ways in which you look around your communities. Like, so I'm from New York. So I was born in the early 70s. I grew up in Harlem, in the 80s. And so, it's the same thing. It was the
It
same
is.
thing as the South Side where you grew up, or on the West Side.
Yes.
These disinvested communities that did not get, right, were food deserts, didn't have any investment whatsoever from financial sectors, largely because, again, black people have been devalued and undervalued. And, if you did have a middle class salary, and were able to move, you made the tough choice to move because you wanted some opportunity for your family. And so these are these bargains that, black folks have had to make, obviously since the time we got here, but just speaking in our modern context, that, black folks have had to make over the generations to find some degree of freedom and choice.
True.
And that's, part of, I think, what we would love people to take away from this is that the subtext of this is not that black folks shouldn't live around one another, or
Right.
that we shouldn't be around one another, or that we should want to integrate, because we need to be around white folks because that's quote unquote better. That's not, the
Right.
subtext of this.
Right.
Ultimately, it's about choice and freedom. Ultimate, like, so there's that. But there's also this whole point that, in certain communities, that were able to get these loans, they could live amongst each other, but have the kinds of opportunities they wanted to. But we weren't, because we weren't able to get the kinds of same financial products. So the issue is not about live around white people, and that's quote unquote
Exactly.
better, from a cultural or even from an existential point of view. It's about, what happens once, we are in these communities, what kinds of opportunities, are we afforded? And even if we fight for them, how are we pushed back against and told that we're crazy, by the way? That, oh no, that doesn't happen. I
Right.
mean, this last 15 years around this, police involved shootings with black people, one of the most revelatory thing has been, finally white folks, or white America, whoever has to realize, oh, wait a minute. They've been talking about this for 200 years. I got some, now we have some photographic evidence. So I guess black people are right. What a surprise. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Just listen. I always say, listen to black people. We ain't lying. I mean, en masse about conditions. We ain't lying.
No, we have
We
receipts. We have receipts.
got mad receipts. So,
We have receipts. We can go. What decade do you want? What century
yeah,
do you want? Because we
yeah,
got it.
exactly. Exactly.
We have receipts. And my mom still lives in Chicago, and one of the biggest complaints when she comes out here and visit me, I'm surrounded by 5 grocery stores, like within maybe 3 or 4 blocks. I mean, literally, I don't have far to go. I drive, but if I want to walk to, I could do it. In her case, it's not like that. You know, I grew up on the southeast side, kind of like border South Chicago, um, South Shore, and they've since I moved out here, they've closed a lot. She tells me this all the time. We don't have any grocery stores, and I say, "What do you mean? Osco's is not there?" She has to drive out in order to get fresh produce. And growing up, I remember where there, I mean, we had some grocery stores, but it has completely changed. Even when it comes to shopping, in some of the malls, you know, you have to just go out. And like you said, it's not necessary. You would stay within probably your own community
Hmm.
if it was there and if it
Yeah.
was provided the same type of service in terms of quality and product, you would stay there. You shouldn't have to travel 30 minutes to go get some food. And that's the thing. She when she comes out here all the time, she's like, you just don't realize how much of a difference. Even when it comes to streets, I used to complain about driving in LA, some potholes, until I went back home and I was driving, and I said, I would never complain again because, driving on the freeway in Chicago, you hit a pothole. How does that happen? But again, and in terms of money, and this is something she told me, she said, all the money is always going now downtown, up north. It's never on the south side. And my mother used to be, she was a block club president for 15 years, and for 2 blocks actually, to the point where one of the commissioners, he was like, Geneva, you should run for office. But my mother was retired. This was her past thing to do.
Hmm.
She just loved community, like you were saying. And she, watching those people organize, that was my mom. Had she been there around that time, that was her thing because she believed in our neighborhood getting, having access to safety, fighting off the gangs. When the Black Club part, hey, Miss Carter, she got everybody on lock. And so now, when I look at and I watch the news and I hear about some of the things, and when I go back home, going downtown is just like how it reminded me of when growing up. But certain parts of the South Side, it's like one every four homes seem to be boarded up,
Hmm.
and of course that depreciates the
Hmm.
neighborhood. And to know that Chicago was a model ground to do all of this kind of contract, with our people across the nation, is why everybody else is getting equity from their home, but yet we're spending 100 times more,
Hmm.
figuratively, just to even live and miss one payment, they're out.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and we, when I saw that, and all I could think of, golly, it seemed like it's always, no matter how, someone told me, no matter how successful we become, you cannot tell our story without dealing with the racism somewhere along that path because it's there. And we've made great achievements, but hearing how they just had to struggle just to even get a house, just to have a family, everybody wants that. Especially if you marry and have a family, you want to raise them in a safe environment. You want to have the same access to health care, food, all those things that are necessary to make your life work.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, one of the interesting
so
things, I mean, it's so interesting what you're talking about as it relates to your mother, because one of the things we found when during the broadcast period in Chicago, this debuted on WTTW in Chicago, Chicago's public broadcast station, um, on April 18th. And, Bruce and I would do these conversations on VON, WVON radio, the black
yeah,
radio station,
right.
and, just hearing how this had stimulated conversations in black households was really interesting, and I had to think about it myself. I'll get to that point in a second. But when I was telling my father about this a couple years ago, when I first started this project, He was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, your grandmother was on a contract in Cleveland." I was like, "What?"
Right.
I mean, and so, there's so many things we heard on the radio, particularly from black, Chicagoans, who, were finding out, this is sort of stimulated
It
conversations about
is.
things that we didn't really want to have to talk about, because as one of the people say, one of our guests on, in the color tax say, no one wanted to admit that they had been taken, that they had been taken advantage of. So you have, blocks and blocks of people on contracts and no one knew because everyone said they had a mortgage, and most of the time they knew they didn't, but they didn't want to again admit that they had been
Right.
taken. And,
Right.
and so, this gets back to what you were saying about the pain, and these painful stories, but to hear them, but to live them, and then have to surface it finally so you could actually do something about it. I mean, just think about that emotional journey. I mean,
Yeah.
so, look, I studied, history and all that in college, and, thought I was, but yeah, I guess when as you get older and older and you keep digging and digging, you just see that there's always, particularly when it comes to our experience in this country, there's always more to learn, but there's always more to appreciate. I guess what I took away from this, from producing and then, being, working alongside of Bruce to really get this to the world, is just appreciating, black folks even more, and particularly from
Yes.
this period, and particularly from like folks like your family who came up from Mississippi with sharecroppers,
Yes.
coming to this place that was supposed to be the quote unquote promised land. And, again, then told, yeah, not only are you being devalued, but you crazy for thinking there's something wrong, and so that's the
Yeah.
that's the double whammy for me that keeps coming up every time I look, I go back and look at some of these episodes is, just, the appreciation for, and not only for the Clyde Rosses and Ethel Witherspoons, who's another one of the contract buyers who's still alive, by the way, um, but the Arthur Falls, and Percy Julians, who were well off middle class black folks who decided they were going to take on the fight and move into the suburbs. And episode 3 explores how Percy Julian, who was a world renowned chemist, moved to Oak Park. And the second night, he has his water turned off by the city because he's black. I'm like, yo, are you
It's
kidding me?
crazy, I know, right?
I mean, think about how crazy that is. Think about, I mean,
Yes.
so there's the Molotov cocktails. There's the bricks in the window. There's the mob. There's the mob violence. Which also episode 3 deals with when it comes to talking about a family that moved into Trumbull Park, which was a public all white public housing complex in the far south side of Chicago, who were up against mob violence, had needed police officers to protect them from the mob in their own house, in their own home. But then you've got
Yes.
the city governments turning off water because they
It's
don't want you
insane,
in their
right?
house. I mean, just think about how think about the lunacy of that. I mean, and then what, each generation, found ways of taking this fight on, whether it was in the hood, south side, west side of Chicago, whatever it was, like the Contract Buyers League, or whether it was in the suburbs, so, Arthur Falls, goes up and, decides he's a really well-known, doctor, who and goes in the suburbs and knows he's going to have to take on the fight, and he does it.
Right. Well,
Um, so,
Carl Hansberry,
hmm
Lorraine Hansberry's father, and I was like, oh wow. And out of his fight, that's where the story of Raising the
that's
Sun was,
right.
yeah,
That's
it
right.
was birthed out of. And
That's
I
right.
said, oh my gosh. I mean, I didn't know that until I, watched your documentary. And there's another thing I thought that was interesting is the syndicates, how these realtors got with the doctors and the lawyers. I'm talking about they get with the white doctors and lawyers, and they formed a group to stand against our people being able to move it. Don't sell to them. If you do, and unfortunately, I think her name was Beth Sather. Is that her name? Her
Barrel
father, who
Satter,
was
yeah.
being
Hmm.
Burrow Sather. Burrow Sather. Sorry about that. Burrow Sather. How her father, um, you know, he had the mission to do the right thing and was trying, but they worked against him because he was trying to help us. And
Hmm.
you kind of see that even today. There are situations where, recently that Kyle Rittenhouse, who killed those two, different topic, but they got him off. And I really believe because the two young guys that he killed, or he shot three, but the two that he killed is because they were at a Black Lives Matter
Hmm.
protest and they were aligning themselves up. So it was like, no, don't, if you even try to help them or
Hmm.
support them in any kind of way,
Hmm.
this is going to be the consequences of your
That's
actions,
right.
And so that goes back to how these people were organizing and strategizing, I guess,
Well,
our
that's
people.
that's really one of the other things we hope that people take away from this is the coordination that was going on by institutions of power in order to create these systems, that devalue Black humanity.
Yeah.
So, like I mentioned, earlier, whether it was the neighborhood associations leading to the real estate associations, leading to quote unquote intellectuals or thinkers, economists who were coming up with ways to organize and structure markets to devalue Black
Right.
humanity,
Right.
Black personage, that led to governmental policy. That, I
Right.
mean, all these things are coordinated. And one thing I didn't fully appreciate, until I started working on this was how social Darwinism, the theory that, that
Mm.
blacks are on the bottom and whites are on the top, just genetically speaking, infused itself into this thinking in the 1910s. Like, so you
Yeah.
can't disassociate, anything, one thing from the other, particularly at this critical moment in the 1910s. Now, it's not a coincidence that, Birth of a Nation came out during this time that social Darwinism was, at its height, that, and, one thing that I think all of us were either learned or reminded of, this is adjacent to what I'm talking about, but still important, you know, when we were, all trying to bring the monuments down, around the South, I actually had never appreciated those Civil War, I'm sorry, the Civil War monuments that herald, Civil War, Southern Civil War,
Hmm.
like people like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, all those guys, you know, those were erected in the 1910s, right?
Yes.
Like they weren't erected in the late 19th century. They're right
Yeah.
at the same time that social Darwinism is going on,
Right.
and sort of at its
Right.
apex. At the same time that the Ku Klux Klan is reformulating itself in the 1910s. At the same time that Birth of a Nation comes out in 1915. At the same time that these neighborhood associations are trying to kick Black people out. At the same time that the real estate industry is figuring out how we gotta, keep Black folks away from white folks. At the same time that there are racial zoning laws trying to be passed in Baltimore and Louisville, trying to keep Black folks from white folks, because all this stuff is going on at the same time, the same historical moment. This is not a coincidence. All these
Yeah.
things are connected,
Yeah.
and the more we continue to understand and sort of just face this head on,
Right.
but these are not sort of random acts of just,
Right.
human nastiness, but that
Right.
they were coordinated, intentional policies and behaviors developed for one purpose. Then we begin to really actually can have a real like a real sort of understanding about where we are today and what some of these social justice movements can be really about.
Right.
But we know it's a tough conversation. Even people who get folks who are on the fence on, on even Black folks who are on the fence. Because we all have had this conversation with Black folks who are like, oh man, why can't Black people get their stuff together? And why are we always complaining? It's like, bro, you don't even know. You don't. I mean, because you can't. Like, if you knew the history, you wouldn't be able. If you were a logical, intellectually honest person, you couldn't come up to that conclusion. You couldn't.
Right.
So anyway, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but
No, 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 no. I love
this
it.
is
No,
yeah.
I love it. I know you're on time, so I want to see if we have a time for a couple of
Sure.
questions or a few questions.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. If anyone have a question you would like to ask for Chris, ask Chris. Please let me know. I can bring you in to the room, or you can type it and I'll ask it for you. One of my friends, she tuned in and she was listening. She said she's planning on getting her real estate license, and she says thank you for appearing because she's learning something. She's actually from Cameroon.
Mm,
She's Cameroonian, but living here, and a lot of times people from across, over on the continent don't necessarily know. They know about what happened. They know there was slavery, but they don't understand the extent of what happened even after slavery, And so I'm glad she was able to, listen in
yeah.
because,
Yeah, it's we actually got a lot of support from Chicago Realtors Association. They funded a little bit of this project, and they put on a really impactful forum and screening of the episode that deals with the real estate industry's direct place in this
right,
history.
right,
I know, look, private industry is going to do what private industry does.
right,
But the Chicago Association of Realtors is actually run by an African American woman, a woman named Michelle Mills Clement, who is really trying hard to confront this history. So,
yes,
and try to make this history, through the Shame of Chicago, Shame of the Nation,
yes,
part
yes,
of what all new realtors have to, or realtors in training
yes,
have to learn, so that they can clearly understand not only their industry's place in all of this, but also how we got here. I mean, the appraisal. I can't overstate how important this appraisal issue is. I mean,
mm,
we know the stories of, one house has black photos in them, the other house doesn't. The house that has black photos, when it's been shown, to an appraiser, is
yes,
comes in at a lower value. That all goes back to 1924 Frederick Babcock. It
yes,
goes back
yes,
100 years.
yes.
And
Well,
again, it didn't just happen. Like, it didn't come out of nowhere.
no, it was strategically done. And I've been, of course, because the snippet that I posted in my 24-hour feed, I posted on my Facebook, and a gentleman who lives out in Vegas, he was like, Sandra, this is great content. Thank you for sharing this knowledge. Because, people, even some baby boomers, they may not have known, unless they were going through it trying to get a home, they may not have known. But I don't want to run over, but one thing that I want to ask is, uh, one, do you have any more upcoming projects that you're working on? Any
So,
more film?
I have a couple that I can't quite talk about yet because they haven't been
Okay,
publicly announced.
okay.
Um, but one of the things that's a hallmark, to what, whoops, I'm lost the top of my head there. One of the things that's been a hallmark and will continue to be a hallmark of my work is trying to find these social justice historical issues that try to just give some lens into how we're living today, and try to shed some light on what are historical inequities, how they came to be. So, 4 years ago, I had a film that came out on the cash bail system, that
I
really
was
tried to
looking, yeah,
explore sort of, again, how private industry, has manipulated things such that, leads to unequal outcomes for largely people of color when they enter the first part of the criminal justice system, which is when you're arrested and whether you're able to make bail or not, and who gets bail and who doesn't,
yeah,
and who gets cash bail, who doesn't, and who's able to afford it and who's not. And again, criminal justice is a tricky issue because it's such a passionate thing because it has to do with crime and opportunity and that sort of thing. But how African Americans, people of color, have been treated in the criminal justice system is obviously not news. But the ways in which if you pull back the layers, and really begin to look at the source of these things, you really do learn new things, and that's
yeah, you
part
do.
of what I've tried to do. Um, is really try to unpack these layers,
Yeah,
peel back
yeah,
the layers of the onion, so that even the things that we think we know about criminal justice or segregation or the real estate industry and its place in all of this, that it's very often a lot worse than you even think, sadly.
I,
And but one thing that's really important to me is always showing resistance. that we don't live and stay in the,
Right.
we are victims of a system, but that there are people who are, taking, who are using their God-given talents
Yes.
to fight back, against all odds. So,
Yes.
the Cash Bail documentary features, some really incredible activists,
Yeah.
who across the country are trying to do something, whether it's in the courts, whether
Yes.
it's on the streets, whatever it is.
Yes. Yes. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time because I know
Mhm.
you gotta go. But I would love if there could ever be another time where you can come back because
Sure.
I want to talk about your other
Yeah.
films. You've done a
We,
lot, Cash
we,
Bells,
we,
Nipsey.
we,
So, I mean, I
we,
was like, wait a minute.
hey, Instagram got us, so we always connected. So you got to worry
Okay.
about nothing there.
I was like, because I watched part of the trailer of Trapped Cash
Hmm.
Bell. I looked at that and I saw the gentleman that was crying, and he was is that the guy that was just got admitted to college, but he ended up
Hmm.
getting into jail
Yeah.
for 11 months.
Yeah.
Oh, that he can even tell, he can even express because he would just break down and cry. And
Hmm.
I looked at some of the snippets of about this. Nipsey
Hmm.
Hussle, and I was just like, oh man, an hour ain't gonna be enough. I have to see if I can get them back. And then I want to talk about, even your time at Washington Post
Hmm.
being a journalist and
Hmm.
how you started on that journey and,
Hmm.
the event that led up to you guys winning the Pulitzer
Hmm.
Prize. But with that being said and done, one more thing. Are you familiar with Brian Stevenson?
Of
He wrote the
course.
book Just
Yeah.
Mercy. Oh
Of
yeah,
course. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to hear him live at the Museum of Tolerance here,
Hmm.
and he spoke. And like he's a dope brother. I mean, he was just breaking it down. I was just like, man, all this
What Brian has
talent.
done is nothing short of amazing, and just I mean, legends, shit,
Yeah.
ish, as the kids say. I
Yes.
mean, what he's been
Yes.
able to accomplish, not only in the courtroom, but then to expand and turn that into legacy work that will
Yes.
last
Yeah.
generations. With the
Yeah.
museum,
Absolutely.
with just this humanity. That's what we're all striving for, is be able to
Yes.
turn these works of art and really force multiply them so they can have lasting impact.
Absolutely.
Generational lasting impact. So
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Oh,
yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
Well, absolutely.
yeah.
Well, I want to say thank
Thank
you
you,
so much.
Sandra, for having me. I really, really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
reaching
Thank
out
you.
to
Thank
us.
you.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
reaching
you.
out to us.
Oh, thank you. I just appreciate you just being open and willing to come on and share your story. And I know
Black
you didn't have to
creatives
do
got to support Black creatives at every level.
absolute right. Yeah.
That's the
Because
bottom line.
it's so many things, and I have an activism background too because I've
Mm-hmm.
produced stage plays for the city of Los Angeles dealing with the homeless crisis. That's a
Mm-hmm.
whole another other topic in
Mm-hmm.
itself. And just I love my people. I love researching more about the history, and I've even gotten to anthropology,
Mm-hmm.
dealing with Africa. I mean, a whole lot of stuff. So, but with that all being said and done, I want to thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Sandra.
coming on into the room,
Great. Thanks.
and I'm going to reach out to you at another time,
Mm-hmm.
and to see if we can bring you back on. And with that being said, you have a wonderful, blessed day
Thanks. You too. All
and a
right.
great
Great.
weekend.
Yeah.
And thank
Yeah.
you, everyone, for tuning in
Thank you,
into the
everyone. And thank you,
room.
Sandra. Appreciate you.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Right. Right. Bye
Okay.
bye.
Bye bye.